In the year 1888, at the University of Berlin, I remember hearing George Simmel delicately describe 10 different philosophies, each of which professed to distill the central and only valid meaning of the Kantian revolution. Of these systems, perhaps the most incisive was that of Vaihinger, which has now been re-edited and sensationally set before the public as the philosophy of the as if, or as we might say in modern English, or rather American, the philosophy of bluff. Vaihinger admits that in the wisdom of the sage of Königsberg, bluff was not the only ingredient, but he collects 100 pages, by far the most interesting in his book, of quotations from Kant's writings, and if these passages could be allowed to stand alone, they would seem to establish a curious paradox, that in that famous philosopher's meager little body there had lived a desperately romantic soul, and that those labyrinthine paragraphs hid the most pessimistic of doctrines. Probably the truth is that Kant, the man, began by possessing the humane virtues and sanity of the 18th century, and that in his person he never lost them. But like many of his contemporaries, he tended to emit principles which, if carried out ruthlessly, would undermine all sanity and virtue. For instance, Kant proved to his satisfaction that the human mind creates its idea of the world, an assertion which might pass for a truism, at least with anyone who has considered the history of science or the biological basis of thought. But in proving this harmless assertion, he seemed to himself to be proving another also, namely, that the human mind creates the world itself, which is nothing but the human idea of it. And this second position, when generalized, implies that no idea can have any object but itself, that knowledge is impossible, and that no truth exists to be the standard of ideas. We are thus brought to the edge of a veritable abyss, yet we are not frankly pushed over, for it is a rule of this game to maintain a perpetual equivocation and never to ask whether we are speaking only of our idea of a thing or of that thing itself. Let us, however, in order to play the game, leave this equivocation for a moment unchallenged. Kant's next move will be to set up on moral grounds certain tenets which he called postulates of practical reason. Leibniz and the psychological idealists had accustomed the learned to the sentiment that each mind is shut up in its own shell and each man confined to his personal experience. Yet practical reason leads us to postulate objects on which our action may be directed and whose presence and character may be signaled to us by our senses and thoughts. Every sense and every language making this report in its own terms, by animal faith or by religious faith, which are two forms of practical reason. We may accordingly reach a sufficient knowledge of the powers, divine or natural, by which our experience is controlled, and this without denying our psychological isolation, which is only another name for our personal existence and spiritual integrity. According to such a view, the first, perhaps the only postulate of practical reason would be the existence and order of the material world, and we might go on living confidently in it like the other animals, our critical philosophy having rendered us sober, but not less natural men. I say soberer because we should now recognize that our assurance in regard to matters of fact is presumptive only. However safe and true the presumption may be, and also that, in its substance, our knowledge is a phase of imagination, a creature of the thinking soul, so that while our bodies are busy in the world of matter, the report of it which reaches our minds is an echo only, and a poetic image. Such, however, is not Vaihinger's view, nor on the whole was it Kant's, for Kant's practical reason did not postulate the existence of the material world. This world for him was only an idea of pure reason or of science, and we may be surprised to learn that what practical reason postulates is rather the existence of free will, of God, and of immortality. Here we might well exclaim that this world for him was only an idea of pure reason or of science, and we may be surprised to learn that what practical reason postulates is rather the existence of free will, of God, and of immortality. Here we might well exclaim with Cicero, Ubenam gentium sumus. Where on earth are we? For we do not seem to be on earth at all. Yet we are. We are at Königsberg in East Prussia. We are listening to the public deliverances of a professor, an official of a Lutheran state, and we are witnessing the difficult fusion in his mind of religious tradition and the system of Leibniz on the one hand, with the skepticism of Hume and the sentimentality of Shaftesbury and Rousseau on the other. The word practical must not mislead us, as if it referred to action in the world and to its implications. Practical here means ethical, and the implications concerned are those involved in Puritan moral sentiment. God, free will, and immortality are indeed the postulates, not of the arts of daily life, but of an attenuated Protestant theory and of a Puritan moralism seeking to justify itself metaphysically. Kant was not thinking of practice at all, but of conscience, and he was expounding the possible postulates of conscience when conscience has become superstition. Very well, let this be the second move in the game, and let us consider the resulting position, which is not a little puzzling. For here again there is a crucial question which we are forbidden to ask. We must not inquire whether these or any postulates of practical reason are articles of faith, suppositions which are believed to be true in fact, like the postulate that the sun will rise as usual tomorrow morning. Although pure reason may not be able to establish them, or whether on the contrary they are mere postulates, like the postulate that if I take a ticket for the lottery, I shall draw the big prize, not believed to be true, yet needed as a false lure or mock goal in the game of life. If God, free will, and immortality existed in fact, we should still need to posit them as objects of faith, for since they would exist on their own account, they could not possibly be parcels of our personal experience or imagination, as are our ideas of them. Such faith would be clear, it would be modest, it might even be true. But if Kant had stopped there, without insensibly slipping into the opposite view, how would he have differed from a poor scholastic, and where would have been his new colossal and earth-shaking philosophy? Yet the alternative position to which logic might seem to drive him, and which Vaihinger tries to assume, is plainly untenable. For if the postulates of practical reason were unequivocally false, it would surely not be virtue to live as if they were true, but folly and crime. Can practical reason compel us to be foolish? And can the essence of duty be never to cease from crime? I might postulate that an aged uncle was about to make me his heir, and I might hope without believing that some day, when I opened the morning paper, behold, my postulate would turn out to have been true, so that the debts contracted by me in the days of my postulate might then be actually paid, and I might pose henceforth as an honest man, or at least as a lucky scoundrel. Or without waiting for a fabulous uncle, my practical reason might postulate that I was already in possession of boundless wealth, though pure reason might show me to be a pauper, and I might proceed to sign checks lavishly in consequence until arrested for obtaining food, lodging, raiment, and love under false pretenses. Which of these kinds of postulates does the as-if philosophy recommend? Perhaps the benign Kant inclined to the former, and hoped that an unknowable uncle might turn out to have existed. But Vaihinger has no such evanescent weaknesses. The heroism and pessimism of his position, which he attributes to Kant in spite of the latter's benignity, requires that the postulates imposed upon us should be avowedly false. Indeed, radical transcendentalism, pure subjectivity, and profound paradox require this interpretation. Without it, why should Vaihinger or why should Kant be a revolutionary genius? The same in all its romantic violence was the attitude of Fichte and also of Nietzsche. It forms the core of the philosophy of bluff as the principle of the universe. Goethe noted with approval that the new German philosophy came to turn dogmas into postulates, and as a matter of method, something of this sort has happened in the sciences, of which Goethe perhaps was thinking. His own philosophy, however, was not of this kind. Where he did not lean on Spinoza, who was an honest dogmatist, he set observation above hypothesis, and disliked to think of any mechanism behind the fair face of nature. Her secret was rather to be learned by intuition of her luminous aspects. For this sentiment, Spengler, a botanist in history, esteems Goethe to be a great philosopher, and I should agree, insofar as intuition of sensuous or poetic essences seems to me a happier exercise of the mind than the investigation of causes. Yet the latter, as Virgil says, is the concern of practical reason, and makes the happy farmer. In any case, the expedient of postulates is something intermediate. Bluff, like doubt and like lying, is a marginal phenomenon. If no one ever really held a good hand, the wiliest and most taciturn gambler could never bluff. It is assured knowledge of fact, filling in the background, that lends plausibility to hypotheses and to postulates, and if they are true, supplies their ulterior verification. Even when, on intellectual grounds, our expectation is of the slenderest, we entertain the possibility that our suppositions may be true in fact. Otherwise, the assumption would be meaningless. And not only are postulates marginal in origin, but in their moral force they are unstable, for it is psychologically impossible to accept a postulate and to live by it without presently believing it to be true. In other words, without turning it back into a dogma. Megalomania, indulged, becomes insanity, and sensation acted upon becomes perception and belief. There was a subtle irony, doubtless unconscious, in Kant's choice of his postulates. Had he postulated that which practical reason actually needs to assume, namely, the existence and order of the material world, it would have been only what every sane man assumed already, what in practice everybody believes, and what every turn in life confirms. But he chose rather to postulate the existence of free will, of God, and of immortality, for fear that they might be forgotten and that people might live happy without them. Absolute conscience itself, which seemed to him to dictate those postulates, might then be eclipsed. Faith in things true or probable, or at least possible, would have been but base earthly wisdom in his eyes, and disgraceful heteronomy. The autonomy of absolute conscience positively demanded that we should live by the light of postulates which we were willing should be false. Otherwise, the purity of the moral will would have been contaminated with considerations about matters of fact. Was this a merely personal extravagance? Far from it. It was romanticism revealing its principle. It was subjectivism attempting to be logical. A critic looking for proofs or refutations might prize it as a reductio ad absurdum of all modern philosophy, but a critic himself somewhat romantic and interested in the life and passion animating no matter what folly will prefer to think of it as a symptom. The romantic hero need not be a philosopher. He need not trouble himself to assert or deny the existence of God or matter, hell or heaven. He is necessarily an egotist and can be concerned with these things only as with the giants and dwarfs, the weeping maids and rollicking taverns of his adventures. They will be foils for his courage and food for his dreams. Nothing is altogether real to him except his capacity to feign. His pose is the center of his universe, and eventually this pose will be more exciting and more sincere if it is somewhat paradoxical. Heaven, he will say to himself, if it existed, would be a bore. Hell might be better worth trying. God and matter may be real, but the one is a tyrant and the other a nuisance. He will defy God by his heroism and exercise matter by his subjectivity. After he has denaturalized these objects in this way and made their supposed reality relative to himself, it will not take much critical acumen on his part to perceive that he need not believe in them at all. Yet in that case, with what counters shall he play, and on what shall he exercise his virtue? Evidently on the idea of these, or of other such things, on the illusion of their existence. Thus, by the sheer force of his romanticism, he will be brought to the philosophy of false postulates, and to the vital duty of bluffing. The revival of this doctrine, which might seem rather out of date, is perhaps a symptom of our times. While the philosophers are returning to scientific cosmologies, the uncertainty of these systems and The uncertainty of everything brings the notion of living by assumptions, yet without faith, near the public mind. Our contemporaries are deeply engaged in bluffing, not lavishly for some ulterior clear purpose, but helplessly by virtue of the commitments under which they groan. You or I may feel that these commitments are unnecessary, but we may lack the courage and the time to criticize them. Therefore, we go on bluffing in religion, in art, in politics, in sport, even in science and in our airs of happiness. No doubt bluff has always prevailed in some measure in human society, because society is necessarily artificial. Suppression and hypocrisy are inevitable. If we set about to establish order in public or integrity in private, men must live up to their assumed characters, as they must live up to their clothes. But the peculiarity of our age is that the safety valve is closed. We see no issue out of our vanities. Bluffers in other ages, when they felt ruined and sick of the game, knew how to repent. They could turn with a clear mind to religion or patriotism or to superb understanding. Today, if we turn to such things, most of us would be conscious of bluffing more than ever. We therefore often accept this necessity with bowed heads, somewhat in Vaihinger's spirit. We nerve ourselves sadly to play the game out, whatever it may be, in which we find ourselves engaged. We have habits, affections, responsibilities, which it would be too great a wrench to disown. Ignorant as we are of any better allegiance, we therefore suffer our discredited postulates to carry us, if they can, a little farther on the road to nothingness.